framing of the powers, he frames them as ideological powers, isms, but all of which are incarnated and embodied in structures, spiritual structures, if you will. And we're going to look this morning at militarism. And specifically, I'm going to trace, that's such a big topic, but I particularly want to trace its incarnation in institutions in terms of technology in war making. Stringfellow mentioned idolatry, and I did earlier in the little summary there. Not only because it's the human agency that confuses the powers about serving human life and creation, but military violence itself, maybe more broadly, always involves idolatry. You follow the trail of blood to the foot of the idols. That's what people are willing to kill for. And the violence involves a kind of preemptive exercise of what's God's prerogative alone over life and death, right? And the exercise of official state violence in more than one form presumes to know or execute, which is to say usurp, the judgment of God, right? Who alone holds the power of life and death. Gandhi said something interesting in this regard that I find illuminating. Generally, he thought of nonviolence as rooted in his anthropology, his understanding of human being and divinity was basically fundamentally nonviolent. But at one point, he said something like, I'm so devoted to the truth that I'm willing to die for it, but I'm not so convinced I know the truth that I'm willing to kill for it. Right. So there's a kind of humility before the truth, not making an idol of it, that for him was the root of nonviolence. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the next step in that, and that's from idolatry to what Stringfellow calls blasphemy. And that's blasphemy for him is basically claiming all the prerogatives of God. And I think back to how at the beginning of the Iraq War, the blitz on Tehran was called shock and awe. And the military was really explicit in expecting awe, in expecting worship almost of the power on display. It's very like Revelation 13, who is like the beast and who can fight against it, where despair and idolatry are kind of fused as one. And the program of shock and awe was obviously focused on Iraqi citizens and military on the one hand, but it was also a spectacle for the world, for nations globally to understand what the U.S. was willing to do, right, in terms of using its firepower. And in a lot of ways, that's really an echo of Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima, which um, was done. I mean, I'm going to say a number of things about Hiroshima in the next few minutes, but I mean, one of the things was that this was the not so much the end of the war as the beginning of the Cold War, right? We used politically, we used the bomb against the Japanese in order to use it against the Soviets so that they would know not only that we had it, they could have done a demonstration on an island in, the Pacific or something. But they wanted the Soviets to know we'd use it twice, right? And so it was in that sense itself kind of a liturgical spectacle, imperial liturgical act. Martin King deepened his claim about militarism in saying, and we talked about this last night, the nation that continues to year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And that's exactly what Stringfellow is talking about in terms of seeing death reigning as social purpose. And yeah, he's said much the same thing, that the neglect of elementary human needs like housing and education and health, the assault on truth and reason, comprehension, language, all of those were part of this death purpose. So anyway, I mean, this is a little long, but I'm going to read Stringfellow here. These are some of the ways in which death is enshrined as social purpose in the nation. Can be described in terms of a specific episode, the war in Southeast Asia. But do not conclude, therefore, that this war has happened in a void or is somehow isolated from the rest of the American story. The power of death militant in America is neither unique to this nation, it is common to all nations, nor novel in this war. It's a historic feature of the nation from its origins. Morally, the search and destroy missions in Vietnam villages have their context in the genocide practice since the 17th century against American Indians. More immediately, the Indochina War, in its most peculiar aspects, was foreshadowed at Hiroshima. Hiroshima is the appropriate event and symbol, though others might have been chosen, because when Hiroshima happened, that war, the Second World War, strategically and technically had already been won. Hiroshima thus represents a decisive triumph of self-serving technological capability joined with military professionalism. A nation doing something simply because it can be done. Hiroshima is the momentous, though not first, instance of policymaking so dominated by technological facility as to be absorbed into the technical process. Hiroshima symbolizes devastation, destruction, obliteration for its own sake. Hiroshima means death as social purpose for the nation. Hiroshima as moral event means that the spirit of death was victorious in the Second World War. All that has happened lately in Indochina effectuates and embellishes Hiroshima. And I think it's fair to say that for Stringfellow, we haven't talked about Constantine, but for him, the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century, which was really Constantine's conversion of the church to empire, was kind of a watershed moment for him. He constantly refers to the Constantinian accommodation. And so, as we've been hearing here, Hiroshima represents this similar kind of, I don't know, watershed is the right word, but a pivotal moment in which death is victorious. And he would say, though he wasn't the first to say it, Hitler won the war. um, his spirit and even his weapons prevail. Uh, Hitler's enemies imitated him, right? If he could do blitzkrieg, right, they could do Dresden, Tokyo, firebombing, and then Hiroshima. And the atomic bomb was actually first conceived by the Nazis, right? But even after they gave up on it, you know, the US, some with the same scientists who left, persevered with it to the end of the war, in such a way that it was itself kind of a sign of the Nazi victory. Last night I mentioned briefly, maybe just to name him, Jacques Ellul, and I want to say a little more about him. Stringfellow had a lifelong correspondence with Ellul. I've got those letters, or copies of it from the archives, and also they had kind of a remarkable, not based on the correspondence, but they wrote books that were very parallel, kind of came out at the same time. You know, they had kind of an intuitive connection. Stringfellow got Ellul from the very end of the Second World War. I mentioned this conference in Oslo, Norway, that he went to as a member of the Student Christian Movement, a big international conference, and some of the folks who spoke at it, Ellul was one, and he published in the International Student Journal, I forgot what it's called, and there he recounted the import of the bomb. Confronted by this instrument of death, it was quite possible for humanity to refuse to use it, refuse to accept this fact. But this question was never even raised. The reason is that the fact itself at the present time seems to be something beyond good and evil. Human beings divest themselves of their true dignity, becoming the slave of facts. This slavery is more complete than that which any intellectual dictatorship has ever hoped to achieve. That was eventually published as a book in English in 1967, and Ellul asked Stringfellow to write the introduction to it. Actually, there were a handful of people at Los Alamos, the technological city raised in the New Mexico desert, to build the bomb, who did attempt to raise the question. If you've seen the Oppenheimer film, it actually portrays pretty accurately him coming across a little notice inviting people to a meeting to talk about I think it was the impact of the gadget on civilization. So there were a handful of scientists who wanted to, what are we doing? You know, what is this going to mean? And he goes straight to them and shuts down. He doesn't allow it. He forbids that conversation from happening, so that certain questions were not allowed. They just were trying. And I think it's possible to think of one way to think about the city of Alamogordo was that it was the level of secrecy that surrounded it was itself a kind of possession of the whole city. Now, in this case, the bomb wouldn't have been developed apart from a $2.2 billion investment by the state, right? That made it go. But in Ellul's view, the bomb becomes the emblem of the the necessary, and the victory of technique over human authorities. He says, in this terrible dance of means which have been unleashed, no one knows where we are going. The end has been left behind. Humanity has set out at tremendous pace to go nowhere. Everything that succeeds, everything that is effective, everything in itself efficient is justified. And from this, that Khalil has a huge body of work. I don't know if you know his stuff, like 3 volumes on the technological society. And he's tracking the powers, propaganda, state power, he just kind of, the whole thing is on the powers by different names. And particularly about the way technology slips the grip of human accountability. So that effectiveness or efficiency, as he was naming there, as the primary or sole value of technological process. And it precludes other ethical questions like at Almagardo coming to bear, and so preempts human choice in things. And he calls this automatism, where the application of technologies is ruled by choices which are simply induced by previous technologies. When Dr. King spoke in 1967, the war was heavily being fought with US troops on the ground, but that was becoming untenable, with body bags coming home, and opposition was building to the war. So Nixon's strategy was first Vietnamization, like train the Vietnamese to do this war, US soldiers or advisors, which failed. And so technologization was the second approach to that, replacing soldiers with technology. And in this case, the electronic battlefield, which was, they would drop sensors from planes that would hang in trees or land on the ground, disguised as even piles of shit. It's like they were, you wouldn't recognize them. And then those broadcast, they were read, the sensors were read and interpreted at computer terminals in Hawaii. And from there, people directed bombing just because there was movement. It could be civilians, certainly, not troop movements. It could be a little herd of animals, but the sensors light up, and what was called the automated air war would bomb, obliteration bombing. And at that point, the war was causing 300 casualties a day. Kind of, I suppose that, I don't know if that's the rate of the Gaza war, but anyway, it was very, very high. Militarism as a principality raises the question of whether policy drives technology, like in the making of the bomb, or whether technology drives policy, right? Creates policy. In 1973, there was a guy, really good soul, Robert Aldrich, some people may know him in the room, who worked for Lockheed and realized that the project that he was working on, the accuracy of the weapons had nothing to do with deterrence. It wasn't like for blowing up a city. It was pinpoint accuracy that could only be used for uh, bunkers, silos, to knock out weapons. And it was basically first strike weaponry, right? The technology, that wasn't a policy yet, but the technology accuracy, he just foresaw, got out and became kind of a reader of, on behalf of the movement, the Pacific Life community in particular. So first strike counterforce targeting has been less a military and strategic doctrine in search of the means, but just the other way around. Right? I'll say this, give another example quick. Thanks the time. I'm probably going along.
40. If we need to go over that.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The cruise missile, which was the first line of attack in the Gulf War, basically a small pilotless jet plane, right? And the U.S. media claimed that Saddam Hussein was inflating the numbers of U.S. planes that he shot down, because he was counting cruise missiles. But the U.S. didn't count those as planes because they were flown by robots, right? And then they were incredibly accurate. The Pentagon claimed that they could fire one from San Francisco and put it between the goalposts of Soldiers Field in Chicago, right? So their history goes back to Hitler's buzz bombs, part rocket, part airplane. And the Pentagon was trying to develop those too, but gave up when ICBMs were deployed and took that place. But in the early 70s, there were breakthroughs on several different fronts. Miniaturization of jet engines, which happened just a few miles from us in Detroit. Electronic mapping of and computer guidance from satellites. Concentration of jet fuel and miniaturization of nuclear warheads. These are like separate things, but all of a sudden they were seen as, you could put all these things together. And Henry Kissinger used the threat of developing the cruise missile in nuclear talks, right? But the military, every branch fell in love with it. Like they developed it and deployed it, land, air, sea, like all the forces. And suddenly, and pinpoint accuracy, it's part of this same, suddenly first strike is a fact, and it gets embodied into policy documents, not only for first strike, but also suddenly it was possible to think about protracted nuclear war, in a theater where over a period of time, there would be lesser, not a full-blown nuclear war, but using nuclear weapons in conventional war. That was, the cruise missile brought that into play. Now we've got Israel bombing genocidal war against Palestine and Gaza. And to be sure, there's kind of a long history of 70 or 100 years genocidal war that can be tracked. There's collective trauma of Jewish folks, and Western guilt from that figures in, and beyond that, centuries of anti-Semitism coming out of Christian supremacy. So there's a complex history, but I'm going to focus briefly on the technology again going forward here, and in particular on artificial intelligence in war making. Artificial intelligence, and Frank here, I get some of this from a webinar that he did, so he's done a lot of work on this. Artificial intelligence is formed of algorithms and neural networks, reading and learning from a massive bodies of data, right? Digital human communication, big data, whether it's collected or surveilled. And these networks are beginning to write their own codes and programming, right? So it sounds like a version of self-augmentation, right? And it's accelerating. In Gaza, Israel has used an AI program called the Gospel, or Hasbra in Hebrew. It rapidly analyzes data from sources like cell phone messages, drone footage, satellite imagery, and more. And their app called Pillar of Fire, it's like, I mean, the idolatry stuff is, religious idolatry is really explicit here. Transmits that information to field operation. And the IDF chief of staff commented in the course of last year that they used to be able to generate 50 targets a year, but with Hasbra, they can do 100 a day. So it's really AI that's enabled the obliteration bombing, along with a policy change, what Israelis called power targeting. If a single Hamas member is in a building, a high-rise building, the whole building becomes a legitimate target, right? And by the end of 2023, like within the first few months, they had already dropped the equivalent of 3 Hiroshimas on Gaza using the 2,000-pound bombs provided by the U.S. And as we're seeing, craters in Gaza are facts on the ground every bit as much as settlements are facts on the ground. Albert Systems, which is an Israeli company, owns say the name of the... Iden, thank you. Owns a factory that makes screens for tanks and planes that actually are vehicles for AI targeting. In Birdsboro here, and folks in the residential community did a direct action there. I don't know if Aaron's going to talk about that, but AI is through all of their stuff. They've also developed an undetectable spyware system called Pegasus, which with one click turns a cell phone into a surveillance device. Even if the cell phone is off, the program can extract data, access the camera and microphone, even when it's turned off. And we also saw what they did in Lebanon, turning cell phones into bombs, right? Mm-hmm. Um, and it's been employed all over the West Bank. It's part of what uh, Amnesty International calls the automated apartheid, right? It's used to track Palestinians, but it's also been used in Cop City here. They sell it to authoritarian governments, and it's been on the ground in the United States. So AI is what I portend is kind of a principality off the charts, you know. And I'm not prepared or capable to make any, you know, detailed pronouncements about it, but it is clear that Elon Musk not only wants to corner, he wants to control the AI industrial complex, and he's trying to either buy companies, Chat GPT, or put it out of business with competition. Stripping away the constraints against it both here and in Europe, right? And I think it's connected to his gutting of federal employees, that what he's going to replace, what he intends to have replace those employees is artificial intelligence. Um, yeah, what could go wrong, right? Um, so we're already seeing, and we're already seeing he's doing foreign policy independently himself, you know, by offering or denying he controls the Starlink system that they use for targeting, and he's, you know, threatening Ukraine with denying them access to it, kind of not as a government policy. This is before the election. I just want to mention quickly shredding international law too. International law is a principality of its own, but it is a constraint on military powers, just as constitutional and legal guardrails are being abolished here, so they're also being abolished. Some folks in the room have used international defense as a legal defense for civil disobedience, saying it's a justification defense because this weapon is a violation of international law. And not that the U.S. has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which there's next week a gathering at the UN of all the signers, and the Atlantic Life community is doing action there. Or even the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, they claim not to be bound by those. But now we're seeing what Hesketh is doing with soldiers is, you know, pulling the prosecution for, it's like the rules of war, international rules of wars. So they don't want American warriors to be constrained in their difficult decisions on the front. Right. A little out of order here, but I did want to mention a comment of Ta-Nehisi Coates. Maybe you've seen the conversation that he had with Angela Davis. And he said, we're at a moment right now where people are asking themselves, why can't the Democratic Party defend this assault on democracy? He said, I would submit that if you can't draw the line at genocide, you probably can't draw the line at democracy either. And he said he was convinced that there was some way in which the Democratic Party support for Gaza genocide cost it the election, not necessarily in a demographic sense, which is how people track it, but in a moral sense, right? So I'm realizing that actually in all these talks, I'm really focusing on these three things as powers, and I'm offering very little good news. And
I taught you that song.
Denise knows this. But I do want to say it's Stringfellow's, good news is that the incarnation means that God has gotten into history, right? And that things are way more dynamic, hidden below the surface than what appears. And whether it's backwater resurrection or birth, the word is that we're kind of hidden in the depths of things, breaking in to break out, and way more dynamic than we can calculate or project. And those who claim to be in control are actually self-deceived, right? I mean, that's the whole thing about they think they're calling shots. Maybe they are, maybe not, right? Death appears to reign, but the good news is death is undone, right? So he's calling us to live in the freedom of the resurrection. So don't be awed by anything but God who raised Christ Jesus from the dead. So, way long. Aaron Fahey, actually, each of the